Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the St. Johns County Public Library System for this special look at women's suffrage in Florida. My name is Heather Sostrom, and I'm the branch manager of the Anastasia Island Branch Library in St. Augustine, Florida. This presentation was created and prepared by the Division of Library and Information Services, Florida Department of State. Celebrating women's suffrage in Florida. Although the day and age when women could not vote seems unimaginable and far in the past, 100 years is not that long ago. For many of us, this means our grandmothers or great-grandmothers lived during this historical movement and might have experienced firsthand being denied the right to vote. The women's rights movement in the United States began in 1848, when a group of women and men met in Seneca Falls, New York, to discuss the status of women. This is a copy of the report produced from that convention that, among other things, resolved that all laws which prevent woman from occupying such a station in society as her conscience shall dictate, or which place her in a position inferior to that of man, are contrary to the great precept of nature, and therefore of no force or authority. The group called for the right to vote for women. At first, this idea, which was radical for the times, was met with little success. As we know, the basic premise at the time was that women did not need to vote because their husbands cast ballots that were reflective of the family's political views. The suffrage movement fought to give women the right to vote for more than 70 years before the 19th Amendment was passed. This was a long and difficult battle, but as women often do, they persevered. The amendment was passed by the U.S. House in May 1919, and then the Senate passed it on June 4th. The Florida Legislature was in session at the time, so Governor Sidney Katz, who supported the amendment, sent a special message to the legislature asking for it to be passed before the legislators went home on June 6th. The State Library of Florida has the full text of this message in the House Journal for June 5th, 1919. Here's a little excerpt. The legislature of the state of Florida will adjourn tomorrow, and it has an opportunity of putting itself on record to be the first state in the sisterhood of states to ratify this great movement upon the part of the federal government. Therefore, as governor of our great state, I earnestly recommend that you, by your vote, ratify this action and add an imperishable laurel to your state, which can never die. The fact of being the first state in the Union to recognize woman as an equal with her brother man in the rights of suffrage. The legislature did not act on Governor Katz's suggestion, and in fact, the amendment became part of the U.S. Constitution without either of Florida's legislative houses even voting on it, since in those days, Florida's legislature only met every other year, and the number of states needed had already been ratified by the time the Florida legislators met again in 1921. Pictured here is Ivy JC Stranahan of Fort Lauderdale. She was a pioneer who worked for rights of women and Native Americans. She taught Seminoles at the turn of the century while serving as the president of the State Suffrage League in 1917. In addition, she lobbied in legislature for the right for women to vote. From a group of 20 supporters in 1893 to nearly 100 by 1895, the women's suffrage movement was slowly but surely growing in the Sunshine State. Years later, in 1912, 30 determined women in Jacksonville created the Florida Equal Franchise League. Later that year, women in Orlando attempted to vote in a bond election open to property owners who had paid their taxes. These women who came forward and challenged the law, saying that if they had to pay taxes on a matter, they should be able to vote on it. Orlando would become the home of its own equality league, led by former pastor Mary Safford of Iowa. Soon after, Miss Safford became the president of the Florida Equal Suffrage Association, which united the scattered societies across the state into one cohesive body. In Orlando and throughout the rest of Florida, these dedicated women worked hard to raise support for their cause. Some types of activities and events they used to advocate for their cause is worth noting and certainly is reflective of their time. some strategies we still see employed today to effectual social change. They gave public lectures, distributed hundreds of leaflets, and asked for donations. Others we don't see as frequently in modern political movements. For example, they gave teas, held banquets, and put on musical programs. There were also groups that offered citizenship classes and workshops to ready women to fully participate in their country's democracy and to prepare women to go to the polls once they gained this valuable right. The suffrage leagues also petitioned the legislature to make the vote available to women. The suffrage question came before the Florida Legislature as early as 1913, when nationally recognized suffragist Jeanette Rankin spoke to a large audience in the House chamber in Tallahassee. The photo here is from much later, in 1963, when Mrs. Horton Swells from the League of Women Voters stood in front of the Capitol. Other prominent women, such as Mary Man Jennings, fought for their rights to participate in our democracy, and still the debate continued among the legislators. Mary Man Jennings was the wife of Governor William S. Jennings. Mary Nolan from Jacksonville was 73 years old when she picketed in Washington and was jailed for her civil disobedience. Eventually, Mrs. Nolan was sent to a workhouse in Virginia. She was not alone in her struggle. Nearly 200 women suffered poor treatment in workhouses for publicly protesting for the right to vote. Even though Mary Nolan was a grandmother, she was arrested a total of 9 times over her career as a suffragist. Mary Nolan participated in the Watchfires for Freedom, where protesters burned President Woodrow Wilson's speeches on democracy in urns to signify how unjust and inequitable the president's words were, when half of the country's adult population was barred from voting. And then, at the age of 75, Mary Nolan, dressed in a replica of her prison uniform, boarded a train for a promotional tour with other former suffrage prisoners, telling their stories from town to town, looking for support from broader society. Women like Mary Nolan persisted with the conviction that they should be full and equal citizens with the right to participate in our democracy. And here's another Florida leader depicted, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. Mary McLeod Bethune was an educator and civil rights activist. She was involved in the suffrage movement from the turn of the 20th century onward. In 1904, Dr. Bethune founded the Daytona Normal and Industrial Institute for Negro Girls, which later became the co-educational Bethune-Cookman College. In 1912, she joined the Equal Suffrage League, an offshoot of the National Association of Colored Women, and worked to educate people on the voting process. She later led a group of the first 100 African Americans to the polls to vote for Daytona's mayor. Now, there were parts of Florida that changed their local laws to allow women to vote years before the nation allowed this practice as a whole. Mrs. Zina Dreyer, who on June 19, 1915, in the little town of Fellsmore, Florida, with a population of less than 400, walked into her local elections office to cast a vote. She was the first woman to vote anywhere south of the Mason-Dixon line, 5 years before the passage of the 19th Amendment that granted all women the right to vote. And it all started in Fellsmere, Florida, in then St. Lucie County. Fellsmere was later joined by many other cities, including Tarpon Springs, Clearwater, Dunedin, and St. Petersburg in Pinellas County, Orantia and Cocoa in Brevard County, Orange City and DeLand in Volusia County, West Palm Beach and Delray in Palm Beach County, Florence Villa in Polk County, Miami in Miami-Dade County, Fort Lauderdale in Broward County, Moore Haven in DeSoto County, and Orlando in Orange County. Marjory Stoneman Douglas was the first woman in the Miami area to enlist in World War I when she stepped forward and volunteered to be a yeoman. Miss Douglas served her country, first in the Navy and then in the Red Cross. However, when the war ended in November of 1918, Miss Douglas was still unable to make her own democratic decisions at the ballot box. But Miss Douglas and other women were determined and they looked for other ways to advance their desired vision. Another important group to recognize is the women who served in public office prior to 1920. Some served in municipal offices in towns that already allowed women to vote. Others were appointed to county or state positions. Some of the appointed women were serving out the end of their husbands' terms after their spouses died in office, such as Mary Jane Curry, treasurer of Monroe County. Others were appointed in their own right, like Mammy Jarrell of Micanopy, who served several terms as the inspector of marks and brands for Alachua County. The first female mayor in Florida, Marion Newhall Horowitz, was elected to serve the town of Moorhaven, a newly incorporated city, in July 1917. Several women served on the state's public school textbook selection committee, the State Board of Osteopathic Examiners, and on commissions in charge of planning for historic buildings and memorials. Women began to represent their communities in areas that, at the time, seemed most appropriate to a woman's interests. Going back to women who were trailblazers in public office, Edna Giles Fuller, who became Florida's first female state legislator, was elected in 1928. Mrs. Fuller became a widow in 1912 at the age of 38. She became active in civic organizations, education, local chambers of commerce, and with the Orlando Planning and Zoning Commission. She also worked to develop a food distribution system after World War I. She did this while taking care of her 2 children, as well as the 3 orphaned children of her brother. In 1928, Mrs. Fuller ran for a seat in the Florida House and won. She gave her first formal speech to the legislature on April 3, 1929. She was reelected in 1930. Ruth Bryan Owen became Florida's first U.S. Congresswoman the same year Edna Fuller won her election to the Florida Legislature. Owen grew up in politics, watching her father, William Jennings Bryan, debate in Congress in the late 1800s. In 1928, she took to her own campaign trail in a green Ford Model T, known as the Spirit of Florida, and made her way from Jacksonville down to Key West. Ruth Bryan Owen won the election and went on to champion for the Everglades and children's welfare, and, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, to serve as the United States envoy to Denmark and Iceland. Caroline Mays Brevard was an educator, writer, and historian for Florida at the turn of the 19th century. Caroline Brevard wrote the definitive history of Florida from the Treaty of 1763 to her own times. Later serving as a professor at the Florida State College for Women, now the Florida State University, she served her community without ever having the political right to do so. Caroline Mays Brevard was the niece of Florida Territorial Governor Richard Keith Call. Caroline Brevard came from a long line of driven, intellectual women. Her aunt, Ellen Call Long, penned her support for women's suffrage in 1876. Ellen Call Long was the daughter of Florida Territorial Governor Richard Keith Call. Ellen Long wrote in an article that women's voting equality would allow them to better support the men in their society, to walk side by side on the road of advancements. She also advocated for environmental conservation of her beloved Red Hills oaks and pines, recommending the prescribed burning for longleaf pine forests as early as 1888. Through her efforts to support women's voices and to protect the environment for future generations, we can thank Ellen Long for the 37 state forests and 3 national forests in the state of Florida. And finally, after this long, hard struggle, the fight for women's suffrage victory was achieved when the U.S. Congress passed the 19th Amendment and required 3/4 of the states ratified it. Of course, Florida was not among them, but nonetheless, the amendment gave women throughout the United States the franchise. The 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, became law in 1920. And here we have a slide reflecting Tallahassee's Daily Democrat newspaper from September 9, 1920, reporting on the first woman to vote in Leon County. It was not until 1969, with encouragement from Florida League of Women Voters, who were celebrating their 30th anniversary at the time, that the Florida Legislature ratified the 19th Amendment. The League's parent organization, the League of Women Voters of the United States, was also celebrating its 50th anniversary, along with the act of ratifying the 19th Amendment itself. Pictured here is Senate Concurrent Resolution 1172, signed by Governor Claude Kirk, symbolically ratifying the 19th Amendment in Florida. The Florida Senate actually voted on 2 suffrage-related resolutions that day. There was the Senate Concurrent Resolution 1172, which ratified the 19th Amendment, but there was also Senate Concurrent Resolution 1168, which recognized the state and national leagues of women voters on their respective anniversaries. The 2 buttons in the center row with images are as follows. Left, Susan B. Anthony, and right, Anna Hard Shaw. Now, nearly 100 years after the 19th Amendment was ratified, women continue to help shape the trajectory of our nation and our world through their leadership. Today, more women are holding elected office than ever before. Women run major companies and are making advances in science, medicine, technology, and the arts. Without the women of our past standing up and speaking out for their equality, women today would not have the rights and privileges of citizenship that we enjoy. The women we have highlighted and the men who have supported them help to pave the way not just for our future, but also for the future of our daughters, granddaughters, and the generations of women to come. In spite of the progress we have made, we must never lose sight of what so many women before us fought for and achieved, and the work we have yet to do. And that is why it is important that we reflect on the past, which teaches us the importance of taking action in the present, and also inspires us to fight for our future. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you of the women who came before us, who, through determined examples, have given us so much. And huge special thanks to the Division of Library and Information Services, Department of State, for this presentation. St. Johns County Public Library System thanks you, and we hope to see you again tomorrow.